Welcome to Luxurious Tales, where African folk tales come alive with depth, mystery, and meaning. Here, every story carries wisdom, every secret has a consequence, and every ending leaves a mark. If you love powerful stories, don't forget to like, share, and comment. Subscribe to Luxurious Tales and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Listen closely. The story begins now. Elliot Ravenshaw learned early that appearances were not optional, they were survival tools. He grew up in a house where silence was louder than arguments and where perfection was not praised but expected. His father, Leonard Ravenshaw, a retired military logistics officer, ran their household like a command post, shoes aligned perfectly by the door, beds made with hospital corners, emotions packed away like contraband. Mistakes were not corrected gently, they were catalogued and remembered. Elliot absorbed the lesson quickly: vulnerability invited consequences. His mother, Pauline Whitaker, moved through life with curated grace, more concerned with how the family was perceived than how it felt to live inside it. She hosted immaculate dinners, smiled through discomfort, and taught Elliot that reputation was a shield, cracked once, shattered forever. By the time Elliot reached adolescence, he had learned to master control of his posture, his tone, his reactions. He became the boy teachers praised for discipline and peers envied for composure, but beneath that exterior lived a constant fear of exposure. Failure, to Elliot, was not a setback, it was humiliation. And humiliation, as his upbringing had taught him, was unforgivable. Naomi Hale's childhood unfolded under a different rhythm, quieter but no less demanding in its own way. Raised in a modest but emotionally open household, she learned responsibility early, not through fear, but necessity. Her parents worked long hours, and when her Aunt Miriam fell ill, it was Naomi who stepped naturally into the role of caregiver. She learned patience from hospital waiting rooms, empathy from listening more than speaking, and resilience from seeing how fragile bodies could still carry dignified spirits. While other children escaped into distractions, Naomi developed an internal world grounded in observation and reflection. She found comfort in routine, not rigid routine, but intentional structure. Morning walks, handwritten notes, careful planning. She learned how to read people, not to manipulate them, but to understand what they were afraid to say aloud. Naomi's emotional intelligence did not make her naive, it made her perceptive. She understood pain not as something to be avoided, but as something that required care. Even as a young woman, she carried herself with a calm steadiness that drew people in, not because she demanded attention, but because she offered presence. Love, to Naomi, was not spectacle, it was consistency. Long before their paths crossed, Elliot and Naomi were already shaped by opposing philosophies of survival. Elliot believed order prevented disaster, Naomi believed understanding softened it. Elliot learned to suppress doubt, folding it neatly behind productivity and achievement, while Naomi learned to acknowledge uncertainty without letting it paralyze her. Their lives moved in parallel lanes, his defined by ambition and external validation, hers by service and internal alignment, never intersecting, yet quietly preparing them for a collision neither could anticipate. At this stage, there was no romance, no foreshadowed intimacy, only two individuals carrying invisible blueprints forged by their pasts. Elliot's blueprint prioritized control and image, Naomi's prioritized care and balance. Neither yet understood how deeply those designs would one day clash, intertwine, and ultimately unravel. But the foundations were already set, invisible yet unshakable, laying the groundwork for a story where perception would masquerade as truth, and where the cost of misunderstanding would be devastating. Before Elliot Ravenshaw ever entered her life, Naomi Hale had already learned how to stand on her own without spectacle. Her days followed a rhythm shaped by intention rather than urgency. She worked as a wellness consultant and rehabilitation coordinator, moving between community centers, recovery programs, and private sessions where people came to her not for miracles but for guidance. Naomi believed healing was a process, not an event, and that belief shaped everything she did. She kept meticulous schedules, not out of obsession but respect, for time, for progress, for the fragile trust people placed in her. Outside of work, Naomi found solace in long-distance walking through quiet neighborhoods, letting her thoughts stretch and settle with each step. She maintained structured journals where she tracked emotional patterns, goals, and reflections, not as therapy but as discipline. Her hobbies were modest yet grounding: early morning walks, meal planning for the week, quiet evenings reviewing notes from clients who had made progress. Naomi dreamed of building a wellness program that bridged emotional support and physical rehabilitation, particularly for families navigating long-term illness. She wasn't chasing recognition, she was building something sustainable, something that mattered. Her closest confidant was Iris Bloom, a family therapist she had known since childhood. Iris understood Naomi in ways few people did: her tendency to give more than she asked for, her habit of carrying responsibility without complaint. They met weekly for coffee, sharing updates not as gossip but as check-ins, ensuring neither lost herself in obligation. Iris often teased Naomi about her patience, warning her gently not to confuse endurance with self-sacrifice. Naomi listened, even if she didn't always adjust. Her family life had taught her that love was demonstrated through reliability. When her Aunt Miriam passed away years earlier, Naomi grieved deeply but quietly, having already mourned in fragments during long hospital nights. That experience left an imprint. Naomi learned how easily life could shift, how plans could dissolve without warning. It made her cautious but not closed. She believed in steady love, the kind built over time rather than ignited by intensity. She had dated before, but none of those relationships lasted, not because of drama, but because they lacked alignment. Naomi refused to rush intimacy or compromise values for companionship. What set Naomi apart was not perfection but clarity. She knew her limits, even if she occasionally ignored them for others' sake. She understood her strengths, empathy, structure, resilience, and her weaknesses, particularly her tendency to rationalize discomfort if it meant preserving harmony. She valued privacy and avoided social performances, preferring meaningful conversations to crowded gatherings. Friends described her as grounded, dependable, and quietly formidable, though Naomi never saw herself that way. She believed life rewarded patience and integrity. That truth eventually surfaced without force. This belief, rooted deeply in her past, guided her decisions and shaped her expectations of partnership. Naomi wanted a life that felt balanced, where trust was assumed and nurtured, not tested. She did not yet know how fragile that assumption could be, or how profoundly her understanding of loyalty would be challenged. But at this point in her life, Naomi Hale was whole, self-sufficient, and moving forward with confidence, unaware that the stability she had so carefully cultivated would one day be questioned, dismantled, and ultimately redefined. By the time Elliot Ravenshaw reached his early 30s, his life looked enviably composed from the outside. He held a respected position as a corporate operations manager, known for efficiency, discipline, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His days were measured in deliverables, performance reviews, and tightly scheduled meetings that left little room for spontaneity. Colleagues admired his reliability, though few knew him beyond his professional shell. Elliot cultivated that distance deliberately. Emotional closeness, he believed, complicated outcomes. His past relationships had been brief and carefully controlled, ending not in dramatic conflict but in quiet withdrawal. Women often described him as solid but distant, a man who listened but never fully revealed himself. Elliot told himself that compatibility mattered more than passion, that stability was the goal. Yet beneath that reasoning was a deeper discomfort. Intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability, in his experience, invited judgment. To Elliot, success was proof of worth, and anything that threatened that proof, emotional exposure, uncertainty, perceived weakness, had to be minimized. Outside work, Elliot's routine revolved around physical discipline. He spent hours at the gym, pushing himself through structured workouts that mirrored the control he maintained elsewhere in his life. It was there he bonded with Tobias Green, a longtime friend whose easy confidence and blunt humor offered Elliot a sense of normalcy without emotional demand. Tobias admired Elliot's drive and often encouraged him to loosen up, though Elliot rarely took the advice seriously. Their conversation stayed safely superficial: career goals, fitness metrics, social observations, never drifting into vulnerability. Elliot's parents remained a constant, unspoken presence in his decisions. Leonard's approval still mattered more than Elliot cared to admit, while Pauline's subtle critiques lingered in his mind long after their conversations ended. Family gatherings were performances, carefully rehearsed, where Elliot played the role of the accomplished son without flaw. The pressure to maintain that image followed him everywhere, shaping how he interacted with the world. Despite his apparent success, Elliot lived with a persistent undercurrent of dissatisfaction he refused to name. Nights alone in his apartment felt longer than he liked, though he dismissed the feeling as fatigue. He believed relationships were meant to complement achievement, not challenge it, and he feared the chaos he associated with emotional dependence. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when he wondered if his meticulous control was less strength than armor. He watched others build families, share burdens, and find comfort in mutual support, all while telling himself he preferred independence. The truth was more complicated. Elliot wanted connection, but only on terms he could manage. He wanted admiration without exposure, loyalty without demands. These contradictions sat unresolved within him, seeds of insecurity planted deep beneath layers of confidence and routine. He had no way of knowing that these unexamined fears would one day distort his judgment, nor that the very control he relied on would fail him when trust became unavoidable. At this stage, Elliot Ravenshaw stood alone, successful, respected, and quietly unfulfilled, on the brink of a life-altering encounter he could not yet imagine. The corporate wellness retreat was designed to be unobtrusive, a quiet recalibration rather than a spectacle, and Naomi Hale had insisted on that tone from the planning stage. Hosted at a lakeside conference center several hours outside the city, the retreat drew mid to senior level managers from various departments, including operations. Naomi moved through the space with practiced ease, checking schedules, adjusting room arrangements, and ensuring facilitators had what they needed without drawing attention to herself. She preferred function over flair, believing people opened up more readily when nothing felt forced. Elliot Ravenshaw arrived late, stepping into the main hall with his usual composed stride, scanning the room not for people but for structure. He registered Naomi first as part of the environment, a calm presence directing traffic with efficiency rather than authority. When she approached him to confirm attendance details, their exchange was brief and polite, marked by mutual professionalism. There was no spark, no cinematic pause, only a fleeting recognition of competence. Elliot appreciated that she didn't linger or over-explain. Naomi noted his precision and reserve. They parted without names exchanged, unaware they would think of each other again before the day ended. Their paths crossed later during a small group session focused on stress management and decision fatigue. Naomi observed quietly as participants spoke, stepping in only when clarification was needed. Elliot, unaccustomed to discussing anything personal in professional settings, remained mostly silent, though he listened intently. Naomi noticed his restraint, not avoidance, but calculation, and found it intriguing. When a discussion stalled, she posed a question that reframed the issue, inviting participation without pressure. Elliot responded thoughtfully, surprised by how naturally the words came once prompted. After the session, they found themselves standing near the refreshment table, both waiting without urgency. This time, introductions were exchanged. Their conversation stayed grounded: work structure, travel fatigue, the value of routine, yet there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Naomi appreciated his clarity, Elliot respected her composure. Neither sought more than that moment offered. When they parted, it felt complete, not abrupt, as though the interaction had served its purpose without demanding continuation. Weeks passed before they spoke again, yet the memory lingered quietly for both. Elliot found himself recalling the ease of that conversation, the absence of performance. Naomi remembered his attentiveness, the way he listened without interrupting or posturing. When a follow-up survey from the retreat circulated, Elliot noticed Naomi's name listed among the coordinators and felt a mild, unexpected sense of familiarity. Naomi, reviewing feedback, recognized his comments: precise, constructive, thoughtful. There was no deliberate attempt to reconnect, no exchanged messages or planned encounters. Instead, the connection rested dormant, like a bookmark placed gently between pages. Their first meeting had not been transformative, nor had it promised anything beyond professional respect. Yet in its simplicity, it planted a seed neither of them consciously acknowledged. It was a beginning without declaration, a crossing of paths that felt unremarkable in the moment, yet quietly significant in retrospect, an encounter defined not by chemistry, but by recognition. Their reconnection did not arrive with urgency or intention, it unfolded through coincidence shaped by consistency. Elliot reached out weeks later under the pretext of providing feedback on a wellness framework Naomi had circulated to retreat participants. Naomi responded with the same measured professionalism she offered everyone, answering his questions clearly without extending the exchange. Yet Elliot replied again, this time asking about implementation strategies, then about long-term outcomes. Conversations developed slowly, moving from structured emails to brief phone calls scheduled between meetings. There was no flirtation, no emotional urgency, only a shared respect for clarity and process. Elliot appreciated that Naomi never tried to impress him. She spoke plainly, asked thoughtful questions, and ended conversations when they reached natural conclusions. Naomi, in turn, noticed how carefully Elliot listened, how he remembered details without exaggerating their importance. When they eventually met for coffee, it felt like a continuation rather than a beginning, two people comparing notes on life rather than testing attraction. The absence of fireworks did not feel like a lack, it felt like stability. As weeks turned into months, their relationship developed around shared routines rather than dramatic gestures. They scheduled time rather than stealing it, choosing consistency over spontaneity. Naomi introduced Elliot to her structured way of living, morning walks, weekly planning, intentional rest, without expectation that he adopted fully. Elliot admired her discipline and found himself unconsciously aligning with her pace, feeling calmer in her presence than he had anticipated. For Naomi, Elliot's reliability felt grounding. He showed up when he said he would, communicated expectations clearly, and respected boundaries without negotiation. There were disagreements, but they were handled thoughtfully, approached as problems to be understood rather than battles to be won. Naomi felt chosen, not pursued, which mattered deeply to her. Elliot felt steadied, as though Naomi's presence quieted the constant internal calculations he carried. Their connection was not built on intensity but on mutual regulation, a balance that felt mature and intentional. When Elliot eventually introduced Naomi to his parents, the encounter was polite but measured. Pauline Whitaker observed Naomi with reserved scrutiny, assessing her posture, her speech, her composure, while Leonard Ravenshaw focused on Naomi's discipline and work ethic. Naomi sensed the evaluation immediately but did not retreat. She answered questions calmly, offered no apologies for who she was, and left without seeking approval. Elliot noticed this and felt an unfamiliar mix of admiration and unease. Naomi's refusal to perform unsettled the dynamic he had grown accustomed to, yet he rationalized the discomfort as adjustment. In private, Naomi acknowledged subtle red flags, the emotional distance in Elliot's family, the unspoken rules, but she chose not to amplify them. She believed every relationship required negotiation, that differences could coexist without conflict if handled respectfully. Elliot, interpreting her calm acceptance as compatibility, leaned further into the relationship. Neither rushed toward commitment, yet neither resisted it. Their courtship lacked spectacle, but it carried weight, a quiet accumulation of trust that felt solid enough to last, even if neither fully examined the foundations beneath it. The wedding was deliberately understated, a reflection of the life Naomi and Elliot believed they were building, measured, intentional, and free of excess. Held at a quiet venue overlooking a river, it favored clean lines and thoughtful details over spectacle. Naomi planned the ceremony with the same care she applied to her work, ensuring every element had purpose. Elliot appreciated the efficiency of it all, relieved there were no unpredictable flourishes or emotional displays. Leonard Ravenshaw arrived early, assessing logistics with a soldier's eye, offering brief nods of approval when arrangements met his standards. Pauline Whitaker moved through the event gracefully, her smiles practiced, her compliments selective. She spoke of Naomi politely, noting her discipline and composure, yet withheld warmth as if warmth were a currency to be rationed. Naomi noticed but did not internalize it. She believed respect grew over time. When vows were exchanged, they were simple and sincere, focused on partnership, stability, and shared responsibility rather than passion. To Naomi, the quietness felt right. To Elliot, it felt safe. Marriage brought with it a recalibration of routines rather than a disruption. Naomi adjusted her schedule to accommodate shared mornings and evenings, integrating Elliot into her structured life without demanding transformation. Elliot maintained his professional pace, finding comfort in the predictability of their shared home. They communicated well in practical matters, finances, schedules, commitments, and disagreements remained contained, resolved through discussion rather than emotion. Naomi occasionally sensed Elliot's reluctance to engage deeply with uncertainty, but she interpreted it as caution rather than avoidance. She believed patience would soften his edges. Elliot, for his part, admired Naomi's steadiness, yet struggled to articulate how much he relied on it. He felt balanced, supported, and quietly reassured that his life was finally aligning with expectations. To the outside world, their marriage appeared solid, even enviable, two composed individuals building a life without drama. Elliot's colleagues congratulated him on finding someone grounded, while Naomi's friends saw her choice as thoughtful and mature. Yet beneath the harmony, subtle tensions began to surface. Pauline's interactions remained formal, offering guidance framed as concern, while Leonard's approval hinged on Naomi's continued discipline. Naomi observed these dynamics carefully, noting how Elliot deferred instinctively to his parents' opinions, even when unspoken. She chose not to confront it immediately, telling herself that families required adjustment periods. Marcia Klein, the HR director at Elliot's firm, appeared briefly in their orbit during a company function, congratulating Elliot with professional warmth and studying Naomi with polite curiosity. Naomi felt the undercurrent of Elliot's world, its hierarchies, expectations, and unspoken pressures, and resolved to navigate it without losing herself. Elliot, meanwhile, felt reassured that Naomi fit seamlessly into his life, interpreting her adaptability as confirmation that balance had been achieved. Neither recognized that balance, once assumed, required ongoing negotiation. The marriage began not with conflict, but with quiet assumptions that would later be tested in ways neither could foresee. The first year of marriage unfolded with reassuring predictability, yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts began to alter the rhythm Naomi and Elliot had come to rely on. Elliot's responsibilities at work expanded as his reputation for precision earned him larger operational oversight. Meetings stretched later into the evening, and business trips became more frequent. Naomi adjusted without complaint, reorganizing her schedule to maintain shared time where possible. She prepared meals in advance, left detailed notes, and ensured their home remained a space of calm rather than conflict. Elliot appreciated the order she maintained, even as he grew less present within it. His conversations became shorter, his attention divided, his responses increasingly delayed. Naomi noticed but rationalized the change as temporary pressure, believing that support during demanding seasons was part of partnership. She remained the emotional anchor, listening without demanding reciprocity, trusting that equilibrium would return. As Elliot's professional world expanded, new names entered his vocabulary, mentioned casually and without emphasis. One of them was Daphne Cole. At first, she was simply referenced in passing, a liaison coordinating logistics for a pharmaceutical vendor connected to one of Elliot's operational projects. Naomi registered the name without curiosity, more focused on Elliot's mounting fatigue. Elliot himself spoke of Daphne clinically, noting her efficiency and assertiveness. There was nothing in his tone to suggest significance, yet the repetition stood out subtly, like a word overheard too often to be accidental. Naomi did not question it. She believed trust was demonstrated through restraint as much as through reassurance. Meanwhile, Elliot found himself increasingly immersed in an environment where performance was constant and validation was immediate. The contrast between the controlled chaos of work and the steady quiet of home created an unspoken tension he struggled to articulate. At home, routines began to fray at the edges. Shared meals were postponed, conversations interrupted by notifications, and weekends shortened by urgent requests. Naomi adapted, but she felt the absence keenly, even if she refused to name it as neglect. She turned inward, revisiting her journals, noting emotional patterns with growing concern. Elliot sensed her observation and felt a flicker of discomfort, misinterpreting it as expectation rather than awareness. Instead of addressing it, he withdrew further, retreating into productivity where outcomes were measurable and praise was immediate. The marriage did not fracture suddenly, it thinned gradually, stretched by unspoken assumptions and unexamined needs. Naomi continued to believe in patience, while Elliot leaned increasingly on momentum to avoid introspection. The cracks were not loud or dramatic, they were quiet, structural, and easily overlooked. Yet they marked the beginning of a shift that would alter everything, even as both partners remained convinced they were still standing on solid ground. Daphne Cole had learned early that survival depended on momentum. Raised in a fractured household marked by inconsistency and unresolved resentment, she developed an instinct for adaptation that bordered on calculation. Her father's absence and her mother's emotional volatility taught Daphne to rely on charm and agility rather than stability. She moved often, changed schools frequently, and learned to read people quickly, what they wanted, what they feared, what they ignored. By adulthood, Daphne had refined these instincts into a polished professional persona. As a pharmaceutical sales liaison, she navigated high-pressure environments with ease, balancing compliance language and relationship building with practiced confidence. Her career rewarded visibility and persuasion, both of which she wielded expertly. Outside of work, her life was less contained: short relationships, restless evenings, and a persistent hunger for affirmation she rarely acknowledged. Daphne did not see herself as reckless; she saw herself as adaptable, someone who seized opportunities before they slipped away. Stability, to her, felt like stagnation. Her first direct interaction with Elliot Ravenshaw occurred during a multi-departmental coordination meeting, where Daphne represented a vendor whose timelines intersected with Elliot's operational oversight. She arrived prepared, efficient, and unflustered, presenting updates with clarity that immediately earned Elliot's respect. Their exchange was professional, marked by mutual competence rather than flirtation. Elliot appreciated her decisiveness; Daphne noted his composure and authority. Over subsequent meetings, their interactions became more frequent, still grounded in work but increasingly conversational. Daphne asked pointed questions, not intrusive but curious, and Elliot found himself responding with more detail than necessary. He told himself it was efficiency, that clear communication prevented delays. Daphne, meanwhile, recognized the familiar pattern, measured engagement, guarded interest, and adjusted her approach accordingly. She admired Elliot's control, sensing both strength and rigidity beneath it. Chemistry lingered quietly, unspoken, neither acknowledged nor dismissed. Outside the conference rooms, Daphne observed Elliot carefully, noting how others deferred to him, how he navigated authority without raising his voice. She saw opportunity not in ambition, but in proximity, access to a world that valued order and influence. Elliot, for his part, registered Daphne as competent and reliable, a refreshing contrast to the unpredictability he associated with emotional entanglements. He did not consider her a threat to his marriage; she existed firmly within the category of work, contained and contextualized. Naomi's name never surfaced in their conversations, nor did Daphne inquire. Boundaries remained intact, at least on the surface. Yet something subtle had shifted. A line had been drawn close enough to invite testing, even if neither had stepped over it. Daphne's presence added a new variable to Elliot's carefully managed environment, one he underestimated precisely because it appeared so controlled. The frame had been set, even if the picture was not yet complete. Naomi's life continued to revolve around intentional investment, even as subtle uncertainties crept into the margins. She leaned further into her work, expanding her rehabilitation programs and taking on complex cases that required both emotional sensitivity and logistical coordination. At home, she maintained structure not as a distraction but as an anchor: meal plans, shared calendars, and quiet evenings she still reserved for Elliot, even when he was absent. Naomi believed relationships were sustained by consistency during uneven seasons. She resisted the impulse to interrogate Elliot's growing distance, choosing instead to offer stability without pressure. In her private journals, however, she noted shifts she could not ignore: fewer shared conversations, delayed responses, a guardedness that felt new. She discussed these observations with Iris Bloom, who listened carefully and encouraged Naomi to remain attentive to her own needs. Naomi agreed, yet she remained committed to patience, convinced that trust required space as much as reassurance. Her life moved forward deliberately, grounded in purpose, even as she sensed an unspoken divergence forming. Elsewhere, Daphne Cole maneuvered through her world with increasing precision. Her professional responsibilities expanded alongside her proximity to Elliot, and she positioned herself as indispensable, always prepared, always responsive. Daphne thrived on momentum, filling her days with meetings and her nights with social engagements that blurred into one another. She rarely paused long enough to examine the emptiness beneath the activity. Her interactions with Elliot became more familiar, though still firmly framed as work-related. She noticed how he relaxed slightly in her presence, how conversations drifted beyond logistics into observations about leadership, pressure, and expectation. Daphne listened attentively, offering validation without vulnerability. She did not speak of her own life in detail, preferring to remain an enigma. This restraint was intentional. Daphne understood the power of selective disclosure. She did not yet seek more than proximity, but she sensed potential in the unguarded moments Elliot allowed himself during long meetings and late calls. Elliot existed between these two worlds, compartmentalizing without acknowledging the strain it caused. At home, he appreciated Naomi's steadiness but felt increasingly ill-equipped to meet her emotional presence with equal depth. At work, he found affirmation in efficiency and recognition, comforted by environments where expectations were explicit and outcomes measurable. Daphne's attentiveness fed that comfort without demanding introspection. Elliot told himself there was no conflict, that his life was simply busy. He did not examine why he avoided discussing work details at home or why he delayed returning Naomi's calls. The parallel lives he inhabited felt manageable because they remained separate, Naomi representing stability and expectation, Daphne representing momentum and validation. Elliot failed to see that separation itself was a choice, one that carried consequences. As these parallel paths continued to unfold, unseen intersections drew closer, setting the stage for decisions that would challenge the very control Elliot believed defined him. The boundary did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It thinned quietly, eroded by convenience and rationalization. It began with late calls justified by overlapping deadlines, then progressed to private messages sent after meetings to clarify details. Elliot told himself he was being thorough, that efficiency required responsiveness. Daphne framed her availability as professionalism, never pushing, always present. One evening, a delayed shipment forced them to stay late coordinating alternatives. The office emptied, lights dimmed, and conversation drifted beyond schedules into reflections about pressure, how expectations could suffocate even the most disciplined plans. Elliot spoke more freely than he intended, describing the weight of responsibility that followed him home. Daphne listened without interruption, validating his experience without probing for more. When the problem was resolved, neither rushed to leave. The moment passed without touch or declaration, yet something shifted, a private understanding formed, unspoken but acknowledged. Elliot returned home later than planned, offering Naomi a brief explanation that felt sufficient to him, even as it felt incomplete. Naomi sensed the change not through evidence but through absence. Elliot's presence, once steady even during busy seasons, now felt intermittent. He was attentive in fragments, present physically but distant emotionally, his responses careful, his eyes elsewhere. Naomi resisted suspicion, choosing instead to communicate. She asked how he was coping, whether the workload was becoming unsustainable. Elliot reassured her quickly, framing his exhaustion as temporary. Naomi accepted the explanation, though she noted his defensiveness, a tone she had not heard before. She adjusted again, shortening her questions, preserving peace. In her journal, she wrote about boundaries, how they protected relationships when respected and harmed them when blurred. She wondered whether she was asking too little or expecting too much, ultimately concluding that trust required patience. Naomi's choice was deliberate, to give space without accusation, believing clarity would return on its own. At work, the dynamic between Elliot and Daphne evolved under the guise of collaboration. Conversations deepened, moving into shared observations about leadership failures and personal compromises. Daphne revealed selective fragments of her past, enough to suggest resilience without inviting scrutiny. Elliot felt understood in a way that did not demand vulnerability, a rare comfort. He justified the intimacy as harmless, drawing sharp lines in his mind between emotional connection and infidelity. Those lines reassured him, even as they blurred in practice. When Daphne thanked him for his trust, Elliot felt a quiet thrill, mistaking affirmation for alignment. The first boundary had not been crossed with intent, but with consent disguised as circumstance. Neither named it, yet both recognized the shift. And in that silence, the foundation for further transgressions settled, subtle, deniable, and dangerously easy to repeat. The affair did not announce itself with confession or intent, it emerged through routine, woven into the fabric of Elliot's workdays until it felt almost procedural. It began during an out-of-town coordination trip, when delays extended their stay by an evening neither had anticipated. Dinner was chosen for convenience, a neutral space framed as necessity rather than choice. Conversation flowed easily, unburdened by the constraints that governed their exchanges back home. Daphne spoke of adaptability as survival, of learning to stay ahead of instability, while Elliot reflected on control as protection. Their philosophies mirrored each other in unexpected ways, each validating the other's worldview without challenge. When the evening ended, the boundary they had carefully rationalized finally dissolved, not through force or intoxication, but through quiet agreement. Elliot compartmentalized the moment immediately, framing it as an exception rather than a shift. Daphne accepted this framing outwardly, though inwardly she recognized momentum. The affair began not with passion but with permission, granted mutually and without ceremony. Back home, Naomi remained unaware, her trust intact and her routines unchanged. She noticed Elliot's increased attentiveness, mistaking it for relief after a demanding period. He was kinder, more present in fragments, as though compensating without acknowledging why. Naomi appreciated the effort but sensed its inconsistency. She continued to invest in the marriage through stability, planning weekends, preparing shared meals, leaving notes that expressed care without demand. Elliot received these gestures with gratitude and guilt, emotions he kept carefully separated. He convinced himself that as long as he fulfilled his role at home, the affair existed in isolation, contained and inconsequential. Naomi's faith in consistency became the very space in which deception hid. She trusted patterns, believing truth eventually surfaced through alignment. Elliot relied on patterns too, but to conceal rather than reveal. Daphne navigated the affair with practiced discretion. She did not demand time or declarations, understanding that pressure would disrupt the balance she had carefully cultivated. Their interactions remained largely professional, punctuated by private moments arranged with logistical precision. Daphne refrained from discussing Naomi or the future, allowing Elliot to maintain his internal divisions. Yet she subtly reinforced her importance through reliability and affirmation, positioning herself as the place where Elliot felt both admired and unburdened. Elliot told himself he was in control, that the affair was an extension of circumstance rather than choice. He underestimated how quickly repetition normalized transgression. Each encounter made the next easier, each justification thinner but more automatic. The affair settled into his life quietly, disguised as efficiency and managed risk. Neither Elliot nor Daphne spoke of consequences. The absence of conflict felt like proof of sustainability, even as the foundation of Elliot's marriage eroded invisibly beneath the weight of secrecy. The first symptom arrived without drama, a mild discomfort Elliot dismissed as fatigue. He had been traveling more, sleeping less, and pushing his body through longer workouts to maintain control over at least one domain of his life. When the unease returned days later, persistent, unfamiliar, he told himself it was stress manifesting physically. Elliot prided himself on rationality, and rational explanations were readily available. He adjusted his routine, increased hydration, and reduced intensity at the gym, expecting resolution. Instead, the sensation lingered, evolving into something he could no longer ignore. The uncertainty unsettled him more than the discomfort itself. Elliot was accustomed to diagnosing problems quickly and implementing solutions. Ambiguity felt like failure. He did not mention it to Naomi. The thought of voicing vulnerability triggered an instinctive resistance, as though acknowledging uncertainty would fracture the control he relied upon. He chose observation over disclosure, telling himself he would act when clarity emerged. Naomi noticed the change before Elliot acknowledged it internally. She saw the tension in his posture, the distraction in his responses, the way he retreated into silence during moments that once invited conversation. She asked gently if he was feeling well, framing the question as care rather than concern. Elliot reassured her quickly, offering vague explanations about exhaustion and deadlines. Naomi accepted the answer outwardly, though she felt a familiar unease settle in her chest. Her instincts urged attention, not suspicion, and she responded accordingly. She suggested routine adjustments, earlier rest, lighter meals, a medical checkup as precaution. Her tone remained calm, supportive, non-accusatory. Elliot heard the suggestion as implication rather than care, a misinterpretation shaped by his own fear. He declined, insisting it was nothing serious. Naomi respected the boundary, though she noted his defensiveness. She recorded the interaction privately, not as evidence, but as awareness. As days passed, Elliot's anxiety intensified. He sought information in isolation, researching symptoms late at night, selecting interpretations that fed his fear while dismissing those that required patience. The absence of certainty became unbearable. Without consulting Naomi, he scheduled a clinic visit, framing the decision as efficiency rather than secrecy. He chose anonymity over support, believing answers mattered more than reassurance. In the waiting room, Elliot felt exposed, surrounded by strangers who mirrored his unease. Preliminary assessments offered no immediate clarity, only the suggestion of further tests. Elliot fixated on fragments of information, misinterpreting caution as confirmation. Fear quickly sought a narrative, and Elliot's mind, conditioned to protect image at all costs, began constructing one. He did not yet voice accusations, but the framework was forming, shaped by secrecy, guilt, and the human need to locate blame. The absence of answers did not bring patience, it brought paranoia, quietly setting the stage for the assumptions that would soon devastate everything he believed he controlled. Elliot returned to the clinic alone, choosing an early appointment that allowed him to avoid both questions and company. The follow-up tests required waiting, and waiting amplified his fear. When the clinician spoke cautiously, emphasizing timelines, exposure windows, and the need for confirmatory results, Elliot heard only fragments. He fixated on possibilities rather than probabilities, on implications rather than process. The language of medicine, precise and conditional, felt intolerably ambiguous to a man who needed certainty to function. Elliot left with pamphlets and instructions, his mind already racing ahead of the evidence. He convinced himself that caution was concealment, that uncertainty was a prelude to truth. The idea that answers might take time felt like a threat to his control. In the absence of definitive conclusions, Elliot's thoughts filled the void. He began to reconstruct recent months, replaying interactions through a distorted lens, searching for anomalies that could justify his growing dread. Daphne sensed the shift immediately. Elliot's tone sharpened, his questions more pointed, his reassurance less convincing. When he hinted at concerns, framing them as confusion rather than accusation, Daphne responded with practiced deflection. She minimized risk, emphasized her professionalism, and subtly redirected focus toward Naomi without stating it outright. Daphne understood fear intimately and knew how to guide it without appearing responsible. She offered selective reassurance, enough to soothe, not enough to clarify, while reinforcing Elliot's existing bias that order equaled safety. Naomi, she implied indirectly, represented unpredictability simply by virtue of intimacy. Elliot absorbed the implication eagerly, relieved to find a narrative that preserved his self-image. Blame began to crystallize, not because evidence demanded it, but because it offered relief. The lie did not yet take the form of an accusation, it existed as a quiet conviction, nurtured by fear and reinforced by silence. At home, Naomi continued to move through her days with attentiveness, though the air between them felt increasingly strained. Elliot grew guarded, his questions oddly specific, his reassurances clipped. Naomi sensed interrogation beneath casual conversation and felt a knot of concern tighten within her. She asked directly if something was wrong, offering space for honesty without pressure. Elliot deflected, citing work stress and vague health concerns, careful to omit details. Naomi suggested again that they approach the issue together, medical clarity, shared understanding. Elliot declined, framing independence as responsibility. The refusal felt significant, though Naomi could not yet name why. In her journal, she wrote about the danger of conclusions formed without dialogue. She did not know that elsewhere, conclusions were hardening rapidly. Elliot's fear had found a direction, and once fear attaches itself to a narrative, it resists correction. The lie was taking shape, not as a spoken falsehood, but as an internal certainty poised to become destructive truth. Elliot did not intend to involve anyone else, yet the weight of his fear demanded reinforcement. He began with Tobias Green, choosing familiarity over wisdom. During a post-workout cool-down, Elliot framed his concerns selectively, omitting timelines and uncertainties, emphasizing symptoms and suspicion. Tobias listened with furrowed brows, his responses shaped by instinct rather than evidence. He spoke of betrayal as though it were inevitable, of trust as something men lost by being too accommodating. His advice was blunt and immediate: protect yourself first. Tobias's certainty offered Elliot a perverse comfort. It transformed confusion into righteousness, fear into action. Elliot did not challenge the conclusions because they aligned too neatly with his growing resentment. Instead, he absorbed them, allowing Tobias's confidence to validate his own unspoken assumptions. What Elliot sought was not clarity, but permission, to confront without doubt, to accuse without hesitation. Pauline Whitaker's counsel arrived wrapped in maternal concern but sharpened by social calculation. Elliot approached her cautiously, presenting fragments of the situation framed as potential embarrassment rather than emotional crisis. Pauline responded with measured alarm, her focus immediately shifting to reputation. She spoke of appearances, of how quickly rumors spread, of the necessity of acting decisively before damage became irreversible. Without naming Naomi directly, she questioned whether Elliot had truly known his wife as well as he believed. Her words were subtle but devastating, planting seeds of doubt disguised as pragmatism. Pauline advised discretion, distance, and control, principles Elliot already revered. Leonard Ravenshaw remained silent when Elliot sought his opinion, offering only a nod and a terse reminder that leadership required firmness. The absence of compassion felt like confirmation. Surrounded by voices that echoed his fear, Elliot's suspicion hardened into conviction. Naomi sensed the shift almost immediately. Invitations slowed, conversations with mutual acquaintances cooled, and interactions that once felt neutral became awkwardly restrained. She noticed Pauline's tone change, polite but distant, as though Naomi were being assessed from behind a barrier. Elliot's demeanor at home grew colder, his questions sharper, his presence tense. Naomi attempted to bridge the growing divide through calm conversation, but Elliot deflected with irritability he did not explain. She felt herself becoming isolated without understanding why, the ground beneath her shifting without warning. Naomi revisited her own actions repeatedly, searching for missteps she might have overlooked. She found none, yet the silence around her spoke louder than accusation. Social pressure, subtle and corrosive, was doing its work. By the time Elliot decided confrontation was inevitable, he no longer perceived it as a choice. It felt like duty, an act justified by counsel that had already poisoned the possibility of dialogue. The confrontation unfolded without warning, its timing as calculated as it was cruel. Elliot waited until the house was quiet, the day's distractions stripped away, as though silence would make his conclusions indisputable. He stood rigid in the living room, documents spread across the table, printouts he barely understood, timelines he had rearranged to fit his fear. Naomi entered expecting conversation, perhaps concern, but was met instead with an intensity that froze her in place. Elliot spoke first, his voice controlled but sharp, delivering accusations as statements rather than questions. He spoke of betrayal, of contamination, of humiliation, his words tumbling forward with rehearsed certainty. Naomi listened in stunned disbelief, struggling to reconcile the man before her with the partner she trusted. She denied the accusations calmly at first, asking for clarity, for evidence, for conversation. Elliot interpreted her composure as deception. His fear had already rewritten reality, and every measured response only confirmed his bias. As the exchange escalated, Naomi's attempts at reason were drowned by Elliot's certainty. He accused her of endangering him, of shattering the image he had worked so hard to maintain. When she stepped closer, not in defiance but in confusion, Elliot reacted instinctively, driven by panic rather than thought. The slap landed once, sudden, shocking, and irrevocable. It was not force that defined the moment, but finality. Naomi staggered back, the room spinning not from pain but from disbelief. The sound echoed louder than the act itself, severing something that could never be repaired. Elliot immediately framed the action as provoked, as justified, his voice rising with indignation rather than remorse. He ordered Naomi to leave, citing safety, shame, and consequence, as though exile were an administrative decision. Naomi's world collapsed in that instant, the accusations blurring into a single, incomprehensible reality. Naomi gathered what she could in silence, her movements automatic, her thoughts fragmented. She did not beg, did not argue, did not attempt further explanation. The shock had numbed her, replacing emotion with survival. As she stepped out into the night, carrying only essentials, the weight of Elliot's certainty pressed against her chest. She replayed the conversation in her mind, searching for understanding, for the moment where truth had fractured so completely. Behind her, Elliot remained convinced of his righteousness, interpreting her silence as confirmation rather than devastation. The door closed with a quiet finality, sealing the moment into memory. The marriage imploded not with revelation, but with assumption. Naomi stood alone in the dark, stripped of context and connection, driven from her home by a narrative she did not recognize. The accusation had found its form, and its consequences were now irreversible. Naomi's first night away from the home she had built unfolded in fragments, streetlights blurring past the windshield, the hum of the engine masking the tremor in her breath, the strange disorientation of realizing she had nowhere prepared to go. She drove until exhaustion forced her to stop, pulling into a modest all-night parking lot where the glow of fluorescent lights felt both harsh and protective. Shock muted everything. She replayed Elliot's words not to relive pain, but to locate reason, some logical bridge that could connect accusation to reality. None appeared. The slap echoed in memory less as violence than as declaration, the moment dialogue ended. By morning, Naomi's phone held missed messages from Iris Bloom, whose concern cut through Naomi's numbness. Iris arrived without questions, offering a quiet ride and a place to rest. There were no demands for explanation, no urgency to act. That restraint mattered. Naomi slept briefly, waking with a resolve she did not yet understand. She would not allow confusion to define her story. In the days that followed, Naomi chose containment over collapse. Iris introduced her to Grace Holloway, a shelter coordinator known for discretion and order, someone who prioritized stability for those in crisis. Grace offered a temporary room and clear boundaries. What could be done now, what would wait? Naomi accepted with gratitude, recognizing the familiar comfort of structure. She avoided social media, declined calls from anyone connected to Elliot, and focused on practical steps, securing documents, updating contact information, continuing work remotely where possible. Silence became both shield and strategy. Naomi refused to defend herself without evidence to confront, refused to chase validation from those who had already judged her. Nights were the hardest, when questions pressed in without answers. She wrote to steady herself, documenting events precisely, not emotionally, dates, conversations, suggestions she had made for joint medical clarity. The act of recording restored agency. Truth, she believed, favored the patient. Elliot, meanwhile, interpreted Naomi's absence as confirmation. Her silence fed his narrative, allowing him to frame exile as necessity rather than cruelty. He did not seek further testing or clarification, he sought distance. At work, he leaned into routine, using productivity to drown disquiet. Daphne offered sympathy without responsibility, reinforcing the story Elliot needed to believe. Naomi's life contracted, then stabilized, while Elliot's expanded in denial. In that contrast, something fundamental shifted. Naomi stopped waiting for apology or understanding. She began, quietly, to prepare, not for revenge, but for clarity. Exile had stripped her life to essentials, and in that narrowing, she discovered a steadiness deeper than grief. Silence, once imposed, became intentional. It was the space in which she would decide what truth required, and how it would be revealed. Naomi did not rush toward confrontation, she moved toward verification. The decision came after a long conversation with Iris Bloom, who helped Naomi separate emotion from strategy. Iris introduced her to Renee Holloway, a community legal advocate known for meticulous case-building rather than dramatic gestures. Renee listened without interruption as Naomi laid out the timeline, work pressures, medical suggestions, Elliot's refusal to seek joint clarity, the sudden accusations. Renee asked precise questions, noting dates, locations, and the sequence of medical visits Naomi could confirm or reasonably infer. She advised patience and documentation, explaining that truth gained power when assembled methodically. At Renee's recommendation, Naomi agreed to consult a private investigator, not to surveil but to reconstruct events through records. Calvin Burks entered Naomi's life quietly, a man whose calm demeanor and measured speech conveyed reliability. He explained his process plainly, verify facts, establish timelines, identify inconsistencies. Naomi felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. For the first time since exile, the path forward felt defined. Calvin began with what could be accessed ethically, public records, travel logs tied to Elliot's work, and vendor coordination schedules. He cross-referenced dates Naomi provided with documented meetings and out-of-town trips, building a framework without speculation. The picture that emerged suggested patterns Naomi had not known to look for, repeated overlaps between Elliot's travel and Daphne Cole's assignments, delays that extended stays, a frequency that exceeded coincidence. Calvin presented findings cautiously, emphasizing that correlation required corroboration. Renee then suggested a medical consultation to interpret timelines accurately, recommending Dr. Malcolm Reyes, an infectious disease specialist known for precision and discretion. Naomi met Dr. Reyes with guarded hope, presenting only confirmed information and her own medical history, which was unremarkable. Dr. Reyes explained exposure windows and symptom development in careful, conditional language, highlighting what could be inferred and what required evidence. He did not assign blame, he explained probability. Naomi listened closely, absorbing the distinction. The narrative Elliot had adopted began to unravel under scrutiny. As the investigation progressed, Naomi's resolve deepened. She did not experience triumph, only clarity. Each verified detail restored a piece of her internal balance, replacing self-doubt with grounded understanding. Calvin continued quietly, seeking confirmation where implications pointed: medical lab affiliations, vendor policies, and compliance requirements that tracked interactions without naming them. Renee prepared Naomi for potential outcomes, cautioning against expectations of immediate acknowledgement or remorse. Truth, Renee said, did not guarantee justice, but it demanded recognition. Naomi understood. She was not seeking punishment, she was reclaiming authorship of her own story. The investigation was not an act of retaliation but of restoration, of sequence, of context, of reality. With each step, the space between accusation and evidence widened, revealing the fragile scaffolding upon which Elliot's certainty had been built. Naomi did not yet know how or when the truth would surface publicly. She only knew it was no longer a question of if. The final confirmations arrived without spectacle, delivered through careful language and documented certainty. Samuel Ortiz, the clinical lab supervisor overseeing records relevant to Elliot's testing window, reviewed anonymized timelines at Dr. Malcolm Reyes's request. He explained procedures, processing intervals, and the impossibility of certain conclusions Elliot had drawn based on preliminary indicators alone. More importantly, Samuel clarified exposure windows with specificity, dates, ranges, and the biological sequence that governed symptom onset. When Naomi compared those windows against her own medical history and verified periods of separation, the alignment was unmistakable. The narrative Elliot had embraced could not hold. Dr. Reyes summarized the findings with restraint, stating plainly that Naomi's timeline did not support Elliot's accusation. The language was clinical, unemotional, and decisive. Naomi felt no rush of vindication, only a steadying calm, the kind that arrives when uncertainty finally gives way to fact. The truth had surfaced not as revelation, but as confirmation of what she had always known. Calvin Brooks continued the thread with equal precision. Through compliance records and professional disclosures, he identified a pattern tied to Daphne Cole's assignments and medical interactions that overlapped with Elliot's extended trips. The details were sufficient to establish plausibility without sensationalism, bolstered further by a reluctant but critical corroboration from Juliet Moore, Daphne's estranged cousin. Juliet spoke carefully, motivated not by loyalty but by conscience. She described Daphne's history of avoidance when consequences loomed, her tendency to minimize risk while relying on others to absorb fallout. Juliet provided dates and contexts that aligned with the medical timelines Dr. Reyes had outlined. The pieces did not accuse, they assembled. Renee Holloway reviewed the compiled material and confirmed its coherence. There were no gaps requiring assumption, no leaps of inference. The truth was now complete, documented, corroborated, and grounded in sequence rather than suspicion. Naomi absorbed the conclusion in stages. Relief came first, followed by grief, not for the marriage, which had already ended in exile, but for the conversation that had never been allowed to exist. She sat quietly with Iris Bloom, acknowledging the cost of being right when trust had been denied. Renee advised patience and disclosure, emphasizing control over timing and audience. Naomi agreed. She would not release the truth to provoke reaction, she would present it to restore record. Elliot would learn what had been done, not through confrontation, but through the same clarity he had refused to seek. Naomi prepared herself not for apology or reconciliation, but for consequence. Truth, she understood now, did not repair what fear destroyed. It only illuminated the path forward. With documentation secured and counsel aligned, Naomi stepped into readiness, not for battle, but for resolution. The truth reached Elliot Ravenshaw not as an argument to be won, but as a record to be acknowledged. It arrived through formal channels first, an internal compliance notice at work requesting clarification on travel overlaps and disclosure timelines. Marcia Klein, the HR director, requested a meeting with neutral phrasing that offered no accusation yet carried unmistakable gravity. Elliot entered the room prepared to defend, armed with certainty rather than evidence. What he encountered instead was sequence, dates aligned against dates, memos against memos, and medical explanations presented without commentary. Dr. Malcolm Reyes's summary was included as an addendum, precise, unemotional, definitive. Elliot searched for ambiguity and found none. The framework he had relied on, fear reinforced by counsel, collapsed under the weight of chronology. There was no space to reinterpret. The facts did not argue, they stood. Elliot felt the familiar instinct to control rise, only to discover there was nothing left to contain. The illusion of certainty, so carefully constructed, dissolved in silence. Personally, the reckoning followed swiftly. Daphne Cole disappeared from his orbit with the same efficiency that had once drawn him in. Calls went unanswered, messages unreturned. Juliet Moore's corroboration circulated quietly, not as gossip but as confirmation within the same documentation Elliot now faced. Pauline Whitaker's response was measured and distant, focused less on Naomi's suffering than on the damage to appearances. Leonard Ravenshaw offered no counsel at all, a silence that cut deeper than rebuke. Tobias Green avoided the subject entirely, retreating into the safety of gym routines and surface conversation. Elliot recognized, too late, how thin his support had been, how readily certainty had been borrowed, and how quickly it was withdrawn. The marriage he had ended with force could not be revisited with humility. The door had closed on the night he chose accusation over dialogue. Consequences unfolded without spectacle, professional scrutiny, social withdrawal, and the quiet recognition that his authority had been built on untested assumptions. Naomi did not attend Elliot's unraveling. She learned of it through Renee Holloway and Calvin Brooks, who confirmed that the record now reflected truth. Naomi felt no urge to witness collapse or claim vindication. Her focus remained forward, grounded in the life she had reconstructed with intention. The truth did not restore what was lost, but it did correct the narrative, and that mattered. Elliot, left with the residue of his choices, confronted the irreversible cost of certainty without inquiry. For Naomi, resolution arrived not as triumph, but as release. The illusions had fallen, not because she pushed them down, but because they could not stand against sequence and fact. The reckoning was complete, and the path beyond it, finally clear. Naomi's life did not restart with spectacle or public declarations. It reorganized itself quietly, the way well-designed systems do when inefficiencies are removed. She returned to rhythms that felt like home to her, early walks that cleared the mind, structured planning sessions that restored a sense of agency, evenings devoted to rest rather than vigilance. With guidance from Grace Holloway, she transitioned out of temporary shelter into a modest apartment chosen for light, proximity to work, and calm. Naomi expanded her wellness programs with renewed clarity, integrating recovery planning that acknowledged not only physical resilience but the psychological cost of sudden rupture. Clients responded to her grounded presence, sensing the difference between expertise learned and wisdom earned. Naomi did not brand her experience as a lesson for others, she embodied it. She cultivated boundaries with care, allowing trust to grow slowly and intentionally. The past became context rather than burden, informative without being directive. In choosing order over reaction, Naomi reclaimed peace without pretending pain had not existed. Around her, other lives adjusted to the corrected record. Iris Bloom remained a steady constant, their conversations shifting from crisis to vision. Renee Holloway closed the case with precision, reminding Naomi that clarity was not the same as closure, but it was sufficient. Dr. Malcolm Reyes continued his work without fanfare, satisfied that medicine had been allowed to do what it was meant to do, clarify, not accuse. Calvin Brooks filed his final notes and moved on quietly, as he always did. These relationships did not revolve around drama, they revolved around respect. Naomi recognized how different this felt from the dynamics she had left behind. Trust here was not demanded, it was demonstrated. She invested in community with discernment, contributing where alignment existed and declining where it did not. The absence of chaos was not emptiness, it was space. Elliot Ravenshaw lived with the consequences of decisions made in fear. Without Naomi's quiet structure supporting him, the fragility of his validation-driven choices became impossible to ignore. He confronted professional recalibration, social distance, and the hollow realization that certainty borrowed from others was no substitute for inquiry. Apology, when it came, arrived too late to reopen what had been closed, and Naomi received it without reopening herself to harm. The ending was not reconciliation, nor was it revenge. It was resolution. Naomi moved forward stronger, not hardened, wiser, not withdrawn. Her life was not defined by what had been taken, but by what she chose to build next. In the quiet confidence of her days, she discovered that new beginnings were not about erasing the past, they were about arranging the future with intention, integrity, and truth. Thank you for listening to Luxurious Tales, where every story carries meaning and every lesson echoes beyond the ending. If this tale moved you, share it with someone, leave a comment, and let us know what you felt. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, remember, every tale has a lesson, and every ending is only the beginning.